Okay, Jay, we're recording.
We're recording.
Yeah.
Where's that camera there?
That's the camera. Yeah.
Cool.
So we've got welcome to Colloquium. I'm organizing this and I'm also presenting the first talk. Before I hand it over to Jay, just some logistics here. So this room is a 48-person room, and under COVID considerations, we want to try and be, not at 48, lower than that. And there's an overflow room in 213, the computer lab, basically, where we're going to simultaneously cast on Zoom, so people can sit there and also ask questions and interact from there. I think Kyriaki is going to be logged in from there. And of course, we have people at Zoom as well. So I mean, it's being broadcast. These will be recorded, and you can find the links on the website afterwards. So, all right.
Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to Cal. Cal Thermalai. He's going to present our first presentation to kick off the colloquium series for the fall 2021. It's nice to be back in person. I missed it, at least semi-alive. We're all still here. I think maybe a bit of background first about Cal. He hails from southern India, a place I visited actually twice and liked very much, the beautiful part of India. That's where he got his undergraduate training at the National Institute of Technology, Karnataka, right? Maybe you get the Karnataka right?
Not really, but that's okay.
I studied his pronunciation.
Yeah.
And then went on for his graduate training here in the United States. Got both his degrees actually at UT Austin, working under Terry Quinn, and further his postdoctoral training was a couple of years at Brown. That was before coming here in 2019, right? He joined us in the faculty. And in preparing for this introduction, I was trying to think, okay, how would I pigeonhole Cal? So scientifically, is he a structural geologist? Is he a geophysicist? And I actually couldn't come up with anything, which is a good thing, actually, as I'll explain in a second. So I decided to call Cal and find out what he thought. So I called him up, I said, Cal, what the heck are you? And he laughed, and I laughed for a long time because he didn't know either. And that's actually what I really like about Cal. What I appreciate about him as a colleague is that he has a wide range of interests, and he comes in many flavors, and he's willing to talk about all of them in a very knowledgeable way, and he thinks way outside the envelope. So I really value him as a colleague. I really enjoyed that. And incidentally, I finally did corner him, and in cornering he said, well, I'm probably a paleoceanographer with a strong emphasis on carbonate chemistry. So that's how he self-identifies. Since Cal joined our faculty in 2019, and this is just my opinion, I think he's established a powerful and positive presence in the department because he's a gifted scientist, and because he's also a great departmental citizen, and because he's an emerging Arizonan, actually. He's developed quite a lot of interest in sort of natural Sonoran, natural history of Sonora, in particular, having to do with birding. And so if you want to know anything about birds, I spot weird ones in my yard all the time. I'll call up Cal, like, what is this? And describe it. You had 3 or 4 calls like that, right? And the birds are changing here because I think the climate's changing. And so my backyard, I find it quite interesting, the changes that are happening.
Usually you get all the birds. So, I mean, you know them already. But.
Well, kind of. No, he's really expert. So that's probably enough. Let's Cal take it from here. It's a catchy title here, lots of M's. But here's the title. Cal, take it away.
All right. Okay, I did get a comment here from Mark Spar saying that it's hard to hear Jay introducing a speaker. So hopefully, Mark, I'm a little bit louder, and I'll stay closer to the microphone here, and hopefully that works out. So please give us feedback on the chat because I can rectify this over the course of the semester. Okay, Jay, thank you very much. It was a very generous introduction. as Jake kind of alluded to, if you pin me down, I basically identify as a paleoclimatologist or paleoceanographer who particularly works on carbonate geochemistry as my tools, but I'm also very interested in really trying to extract these signatures from chemistry and trying to see how this information can really help us curtail future changes and constrain where we're headed to in the future. Okay, so my talk today has a lot of M's in it. It's titled Methane Monsoons and Milankovitch Modulation of Millennial-scale Variability. Hopefully I can break down all these terms and kind of show you what we've worked on in this project. Let's see, this is not working here. Come on. Okay, so I just wanted to point out that, oops, no, it is working. Okay, so this paper, the content of this talk was published last year in GRL. So if you want to take a closer look, I would point you towards this paper. And if you think it's full of gibberish, please let me know and we can talk about it. And this is NSF funded work, so I thank my co-authors and NSF for help on this. Okay, let's just dive into this. Methane, okay, that's going to be one of the focal points of my talk. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas contributing about 18% of modern radiative forcing. You can see this little dance that this molecule is doing. It's just one carbon and 4 hydrogens. And this particular motion is the vibrational frequency at which methane is actually a greenhouse gas. So it basically traps outgoing long-wave radiation. And what's particularly concerning is that methane is on the up. So here's just a plot of methane in nanomole per mole, or in ppb, parts per billion. And here is 1650, 1700, about 1988. This is actually from last year. So we're about close to 1900. I think we've already passed it this year. So methane is a very, we really want to know what controls methane. And obviously this long-term rise is coming from anthropogenic sources, but we want to understand how this is going to evolve, because methane gets oxidized to carbon dioxide, and it's basically additionally contributing to the greenhouse effect as well. Okay, so here are some of the natural sources of methane. Let's put aside anthropogenic sources for now. And primarily there are 3 major sources. There's biogenic methane, which is by and large the largest driver of natural methane variability. This is a picture of Sweetwater wetlands from right around the corner here. And basically it hosts a lot of methanogenic bacteria that are basically giving off methane as a byproduct. And that's one of the major sources, this biogenic component of methane. We also have thermogenic sources, which is basically the sort of the geological release of methane, of long-term methane that's been stored and generated as fossil fuel through multiple ways in which it can be generated. But the release of that basically comes under this thermogenic source. And another large substantial source of methane to the atmosphere today and in the past is basically pyrogenic sources, basically the incomplete combustion of biomass and soil carbon can give rise to methane in the atmosphere. Now, when you superimpose the anthropogenic aspect here, really what's happening, of course, is pyrogenic from us burning methane or burning fuels that emit methane, same part of incomplete combustion. And then there's also this major component from the biogenic sources, basically through agriculture and livestock. Okay, and there's only one sink of methane, or by and large, this accounts for about 98% of the sink of methane, and it has to do with the reaction with this hydroxyl radical that's in the atmosphere, and that's what basically takes out methane. And it can get oxidized, but it goes into different forms through this hydroxyl radical. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm mainly going to be focusing on this biogenic aspect, and that's one of the sources that we want to constrain in terms of natural variability. and what the paleoclimate record can actually bring to us. And before we go into there, just a little bit more on modern methane variability. Here is a figure from Guo et al. 2011. It's a great paper if you're interested in methane dynamics across glacial and interglacial variability. So here is a plot showing you the wetland distribution today. Again, wetlands, why wetlands? Because that's where you have the biogenic, methanogenic bacteria that basically give rise to methane. And you can see the wetland distribution. It's pretty much, it's quite extensive across the terrestrial realm, but you can see kind of this clustering over here in kind of Siberia, Eurasia, and also lots of wetlands in the tropics as well. Now, here is a model that estimates wetland-based CH4 emissions, tries to isolate out the methane that's coming from these wetlands. And you can see, despite the larger distribution of wetlands in the northern sort of boreal forests, the emissions are more intense coming from the tropics, okay? And when you look at this in terms of a latitudinal picture, so here's the northern, North Pole, South Pole is over here, Southern Hemisphere. You can kind of see this bimodality. These are three different estimates of the methane budget. And you can kind of see that there's a rivalry between the tropics and the boreal northern latitudes. And the tropical wetland distribution is really driven by seasonal monsoon precipitation. Things what's going on in our backyard can actually change this wetland distribution on different time scales, on different spatial scales as well. And here's just a cartoon explaining, the summer monsoon circulation, a very ideal fashion, where you have high pressure over the oceans, you have low pressure over the hot land surface during summer. That drives the circulation cell, and essentially you're going to have rainfall over the land. Again, this is, mind you, this is a simplistic cartoon, but the idea is that these methanes, the monsoons, seasonally drive wetland distribution. So there's always been talk about linking monsoons with methane variability in terms of future scales, but also in the past paleoclimate record. Now, on the flip side, when we come to the this peak right here in the northern hemisphere, there's different types of sources that arise, and particularly sources that are being unlocked today with ongoing anthropogenic global warming. And one of those sources is basically, you can see right here, is permafrost. And the thawing of permafrost due to rising temperatures is essentially giving off methane. Okay. And furthermore, you can see these are basically called, these features here are called thermal karst lakes. These are these giant lakes that are being formed because methane is being removed from the permafrost due to the temperature. And you're essentially forming these wetlands that, again, then can have bacteria and can have biogenic sources of methane as well. Okay, so there's kind of a debate both in the observational realm, in the modeling realm for the future, but also in the paleoclimate realm of, what dominates? Is it the low latitudes or the high latitudes? And what's really driving future methane reservoirs? Where do we need to focus our attention to? This is a key topic here in terms of what the paleoclimate record can bring is actually quite important in terms of trying to constrain some of these scenarios, because again, methane feeds back onto the hydrological cycle and additionally can get oxidized into carbon dioxide. So the pivot to the paleoclimate record is that Earth's paleoclimate history can provide really valuable insights into natural methane cycling. So here's a picture of a piece of an ice core, and you can see all of these tiny little bubbles that are preserved in the ice. These are literally bubbles of ancient atmosphere that are trapped in the ice. And so we have very good constraints on past methane variability up till a certain point, till the ice cores basically last. Now, what does that look like? Remember, today we're somewhere close to 1900 ppb today, right? Well, here is the past 700,000 years, 800,000 years of methane variability. So modern is right over here, and all the way over here is 800,000 years ago from the ice cores. And remember, we're up here, okay? So it's screaming sort of signal of anthropogenic forcing right here. And basically, the paleoclimate records put this into context and talk about, how unprecedented modern levels are. So that's one aspect for sure. It gives us this baseline. But how do we go from extracting this information to actually talking about processes? And what is really important is it insulation in the tropics that's driving monsoons that's giving rise to this variability, or is it something to do with the higher latitudes? Okay, and I will say, spoiler, that majority of the workers in the past climate record for methane really kind of shy away from saying anything apart from a monsoon control. Basically, a lot of work has established pretty nicely that monsoons are what are in the driver's seat. That's kind of a spoiler, but I'll get to that. Now, one of the other things here is that you can clearly see, if you zoom into this, this really blows up the picture, but there's a lot of glacial interglacial variability, but there's also a lot of this finer structures, which is millennial scale variability. Okay, things that happen on 1,000-year timescales. And before we go to the millennial scale, let me just point out that the variability that's observed in methane, if you take this and decompose it into its components, we'll talk about that in a little bit more in detail, you basically get the major frequencies of orbital forcing or Milankovitch cycling, basically changes in the Earth's orbit that actually imprint itself onto the signature of methane that you're measuring in ice cores. That blows my mind, but this is an established, very well established fact that all of these different components imprint themselves to give this record of methane change. So you have obliquity, or changes in the Earth's tilt, eccentricity, or how circular the Earth's orbit is, which has a beat of about 100,000 years. Obliquity is at 41. And then, of course, you have precession, or the wobble of the Earth around the orbit, that basically has a full cycle every 21,000, 23,000 years or so. So methane variance is consistent with that orbital aspect. So if you take, what I mean by that is if you take a, okay. Yeah, okay. So if you take this is the same time series that was there before, but if you take this time series and perform a spectral analysis on it, so you're essentially decomposing this from the time domain into the frequency domain and trying to see how periodic certain frequencies might be, well, lo and behold, you actually have peaks at eccentricity. This is a peak at 100,000 years. You have a peak at tilt. You have a small but still significant peak at precession as well. So all these different components are manifest in this record, okay? So we have a clear evidence to say that external orbital forcing is basically driving changes in methane. Now, this is one time series, though. It doesn't tell us where the methane's coming from or what are the processes driving it. Mind you, this is a core from Antarctica. The Greenland ice cores only go back about 150,000 years or so. So this is really from Antarctica, going back 800,000 years. Now, how did this come about? Well, really, one of the seminal papers goes back to 1990 Nature. Chapales and others, basically, they were the first ones to start measuring on a higher resolution than glacial interglacial cyclicity of methane in these bubbles. And as you can see here, here's their record from the Vostok ice core in Antarctica. And all of these dots are their measurements of methane in parts per billion. And they were pretty shocked to find these orbital variations within glacial interglacial cycles. So here's the interglacial Holocene right here. And this is the last glacial maximum. Here is the previous interglacial. So, they would have thought that, okay, it's basically the picture before this was that it's high in the interglacial, it's low in the glacial. Okay. But when they started to reconstruct more and more higher resolution, they started to see these higher frequency orbital signals inside this ice core methane reconstruction. And in this paper, they actually linked this to a model simulation. Mind you, this is from 1990, so the models were not as advanced as they are today. But here's a model simulation that says delta P in percentage of South Asia. So this is South Asian monsoon variability according to a model. And that looks pretty good, right? They basically said that, hey, these wiggles look like these wiggles, and we think that there's a causal effect based on observations that monsoons are driving methane variability on these orbital timescales. So the hypothesis is that monsoons can expand wetlands or contract wetlands, and this is a direct control on methane variability on the orbital timescale. Now let's fast forward a couple more years to 1996, even higher resolution reconstruction started coming out. This is from Ed Brook and others. And once they started looking at even within those orbital cycles, you started to see a lot of variability of methane. This is methane right here. This is oxygen isotopes in the ice core. And here's insulation that's changing because of orbital forcing. And these authors actually were able to find linkages even on these millennial timescales, things that happen on thousands of years, much shorter timescales than even the shortest orbital periodicity. Okay, so things that happen, and these things onset in a matter of decades, and they can persist for 1,000 to 2,000 years. Things like Dansgaard-Ushker cycles, some of you may have heard, or Heinrich events. So these millennial scale events, this paper basically showed that methane varies on these millennial scale events as well. And very interestingly, these authors, they found something that they call a modulation. Now, this term modulate, it's used quite extensively in the paleoclimate literature, and oftentimes not accurately in the statistical way in which what the term modulate actually means. So we'll go through that, but they postulate that insulation may have modulated the effects of interstadial climate change. Now, this statement is quite profound for 1996. It's amazing. What they're saying is that, see, insulation does not vary on millennial scale timescales. This varies on orbital timescales. You see how smooth it is. There's no millennial scale changes. But they're saying that insulation has a control on that shorter term variability. That's what they mean by the term modulate. What they mean by that is, okay, when this is low, when insulation's low, they're seeing not much variability. When things are high, they see a lot of variability, was what they posited here. Okay, and that's really interesting because that can then tell us about the direct controls on shorter timescales that are applicable for, say, human societal timescales. Okay, so this was a very interesting observation in this paper. And so just to recap so far, I've dropped a lot of different terminologies and timescales. The essential idea is that, you know, orbital forcing and insulation change occurs on these timescales, 20,000 years and above, longer. The millennial scale variability happens on 1,000 to 10,000 years. So it's a completely separate part of the spectrum. And the hypothesis is that methane is driven by the monsoons across both ranges of timescales. And then this leads to the really important question here: is millennial scale forcing or millennial scale climate change, is that modulated by orbital forcing? If we are able to detect a longer term control on shorter term variability, that represents a pretty big advance in our understanding of the carbon cycle and methane variability. This was 96, okay? Fast forward many years later, we started to get really quantitative, or so we thought, reconstructions of rainfall, but it's not really rainfall. I'll come to that in a second, but of hydroclimate. That's kind of the term that people throw around nowadays, from cave deposits. Okay, the idea here being that ultimately the cave decorations that grow here, speleothems, stalagmites, stalactites, and so on, they are somewhat driven as a function of the amount of rainwater, the chemical composition of that rainwater, and ultimately how that trickles down into the groundwater, percolates through the Karst system, and then deposits these features. The idea is that if you then go in to take one of these stalagmites and measure the oxygen isotope composition of the calcium carbonate of these speleothems, that they are driven by variations in the rainwater isotopes. And the rainwater isotopes are in turn controlled by various different factors. It could be rainfall amount, the type of convection, the source of the moisture, different aspects, okay? So this really emerged after all of these ice core studies came out. And you know, people have been studying speleothems for decades, but in terms of the quantitative reconstructions required to test some of these predictions, This started coming out, I want to say probably in the late 90s, and really became a cottage industry in the last 15 years, I would say. And one of the crowning pinnacles of speleothem science comes from China. And these three caves right here are jointly used to reconstruct this record right here. So let me orient you. There's a lot of wiggles here, but here is modern, again, 0, and going back 700,000 years. These are all, and the other really amazing thing about speleothems is they can be absolutely dated very, very well. Unlike, I mean, ice core dating is pretty good, but it's not absolute radiometrically dated like speleothems, because you can use uranium-thorium disequilibrium dating to really get good absolute age constraints on the speleothem. So, in paleoclimate, and especially when you're looking at periodicities, you're only as good as your age model. And so that's where really speleothems bring a lot of weight to the table, because they're able to be dated so precisely. So here is 640,000 years of the green. It comes from speleothem auction isotopes from these different caves. And, or if you can see this pink right here, the pink underlying the green is essentially insolation at 65 degrees north in the northern hemisphere. And then here's the same thing that I showed you before. It's the breakdown of insolation into its different components of precession, eccentricity, and obliquity. So essentially, if you add these three things up, you basically get the pink, okay? And the key aspect here is that these speleothems, they do not look like glacial interglacial ice volume. This blue record right here is the benthic delta 18O record of foraminifera from the deep sea that represents, that varies as a function of essentially ice volume on the planet. And so over the last 600,000 years, we've had various glacial interglacial cycles and kind of have this 100,000 year beat that simply does not exist in these speleothems. The speleothems do, however, respond quite well to precession, because precession is the major driver of insolation on these timescales. Okay, so these cave records came out, and what these authors do, this is 2016, so very recent, okay? And what these authors do is they basically said, okay, we're going to focus on the suborbital component, the millennial scale component. Let's take a look at this. And what they see is, okay, here's the green and here's the pink. This is the same plot as that, blown up to the first 350,000 years. And they said the way we are going to isolate the millennial scale component is by subtracting the pink from the green. They wanted to normalize the pink from the green, and wanted to, because it's such a nice fit that if you subtract it, you're going to be focusing on the millennial scale. That was what these authors did. And when you subtract that, you get the blue. So the blue is their record of millennial scale climate change, that fast, abrupt scale climate change in the monsoon. The orange right here is another curve of insolation during July that they kind of conveniently shifted because it fits better, but it fits pretty nicely, okay? And so these guys also posited that, wait a second, when you take a spectrum on this blue, you get 100,000 year, 41,000 year, and 23,000 years. On the blue, I've subtracted out insolation, I've got a residual, and I still get Milankovitch frequencies in the residual. So this was a Nature paper, and they basically say, does this confirm that modulation, where insolation affects the monsoons on the orbital timescale, which changes wetlands, and that gives rise to methane? Apparently, this is all consistent. We're pretty good, right? This also confirms that, except not. Because if you look at this, their insolation is actually the opposite. Insolation goes down this way. This is 560 watts per meter square. This is 440. So these guys, in fact, argue the exact opposite. They say that the suborbital component is inversely correlated to insolation. So to take a step back and put this more into a bigger picture, I'm calling this the modulation paradox, where the speleothems are basically saying that high insolation corresponds to weakened millennial scale monsoons. The ice cores are saying that methane is suppressed during low insolation. So they don't jive with that hypothesis of monsoons drive wetlands drives methane. There's something that, and mind you, these papers don't even talk to each other. So this is something that we found out is inconsistent. How is this mechanism jiving with both of these? They can't. So something's got to give here. So we wanted to really investigate this from a sort of a signal processing perspective. I'll caveat here and say, we really want to go down to the question of what is modulation? Okay, from a signal processing perspective, what is modulation? Well, if you have and by the way, we use modulation all the time, AM, FM radio, and near various fields, I'm sure you guys use it. And this is a signal processing concept that says, here's a modulator, here's a carrier wave, and you can either have an amplitude modulation, that's going to mirror this modulator right here, or you can have frequency modulation. There are definitive ways to back calculate what the modulator was, what the carrier was based on your signals. Okay. So in our case right here, orbital forcing is the purported modulator, the external forcing. The climate Earth system is our carrier. And ultimately, the modulated signal is the paleoclimate record. That's what we're trying to see. So we came up with an algorithm to basically trace back if this modulation is really at play. The way we do that, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm happy to, if people want. We take a raw record, we filter it with a bandpass filter, or different types of filters. Then we take the envelope of that filtered record. This is also known as a Hilbert filter, for some of you may know. So we take the envelope of that filtered record and calculate its variance, and then basically do spectral analysis on the variance of the filtered record. So I'll walk you through exactly how we do this. But this is arguably a better way than to just subtract insolation from a speleothem record and get the residual. Because remember, if you subtract a sine wave from a straight line, the residual is going to have sine wave periodicity. Okay, so in order to circumvent this, in order to really dive into whether these signals actually hold these modulating tones or not, we applied this algorithm. So here's what it looks like. Here's the record of atmospheric methane, same plot that you all saw before. And the raw record has eccentricity, tilt, and precession. So these, this is in frequency in cycles per kiloyear. So if you basically invert this, you get 20,000 years, 41,000 years, 100,000 years. That's the raw methane record from these ice cores. The next thing we do is filter. We want to focus on the millennial scale. So we use a bandpass filter to only look at the 1,000 to 10,000 year component. And so you can see it becomes very high frequency compared to this. You remove this glacial interglacial changes. And I promise you, all of your favorite millennial scale events are inside this. Heinrich event, Younger Dryas, you name it, it's there. When you take a spectral analysis of this, by construction, there's nothing in the lower frequency, right? By construction, that's my filter's working, great, okay? And all of these peaks right here are the exact same peaks here. So really, what this plot says is that orbital forcing dominates the millennial scale, which is quite evident right here, right? The next thing we do is take the envelope of this. Okay, when we do that, we fill in this space. When we separate these envelopes and look at the spectrum of each individual envelope, we fill in that space in the spectra. And we're now trying to see the amplitude of that. We're trying to find beats in the changes in the amplitude, essentially. Now, the final step, I'll come to this spectra in a second, but the final step is we basically calculate a variance of this millennial scale. How variable is the millennial scale variability? That's what we're asking here. And here's the amazing thing. When we take a spectra of both of these two should look similar. All of a sudden, we're finding that the magnitude of millennial scale variability, how variable is this magnitude? we see a sign of precession, a strong peak of precession. This is one of those results that you go back and say, I've screwed something up. I need to recheck my calculations here. But the bottom line is that the magnitude of millennial scale methane variability contains a fingerprint of insulation. So this actually confirms Ed Brooks and others, their ideas in 1996. This says that in this raw record of methane, when you focus on the millennial scale, insulation is controlling how high your amplitudes go in the millennial scale. This is pretty amazing. Okay, and when we take a closer look at this, here's that millennial scale. So this term is going to come up over and over, but MMV is basically the magnitude of millennial scale variabilities. It's the strength of the variance. Okay, and when we compare methane's MMV to precession insulation, we can basically see that visually, just looking at this, that MMV is high when northern hemisphere insolation, which is up, which corresponds to precession minima, is also high. So essentially, whenever you have higher insolation coming in, methane's going crazy. There's a lot of variability in methane. To hone in on this even closer, here's something known as a wavelet plot. Many of you are familiar with this. For those of you who are not, the way to read this plot is basically, so this is a cross wavelet of coherence between the MMV of methane and eccentricity, tilt, and precession. So the overall orbital forcing. The way to read this plot is basically that you have higher periodicities going up and lower periodicities going down. Okay, and if there is lighter colors, these lighter colors imply a stronger degree of coupling between the two records. On the x-axis is time, but on the y-axis here is periodicity. So how coupled are these two time series on the periodicity of precession, obliquity, eccentricity? And this bounds right here, that's basically the confidence limits. So we can't really interpret stuff that are inside those bounds over here, but they give us a good idea. Essentially, so if we see a straight line here, right, like if this was completely white, that means that they would be 100% coherent at the eccentricity band. That's how we would describe this relationship. So what do we see here? Oh, I should also mention, there are arrows on this. What are the arrows saying? The arrows basically tell you the phasing. Is something leading? Is something lagging? Is insulation leading methane or not? And the way that to read this is that up or down are leads or lags. And in this case, up would mean that insulation is leading methane. But right or left talks about phasing on the, in terms of the direct phasing, so in phase or anti-phase. Bottom line take home for this plot right here. We see at the precession band, even though it goes out, it kind of comes back in. There's a persistent signature. There's some in obliquity as well. Eccentricity, we can't really interpret, but all of the arrows are pointing this way. That means they're in phase, arguing for a direct control of insulation on methane. So it's basically kind of robustly supporting our other independent analysis. And so this says they're strongly coherent and in phase with precession. And it is coherent and in phase with obliquity, confirming that insulation has an imprint on millennial scale methane variability. What happens with the Chinese speleothem records of monsoon? Purported monsoon, I should say. Well, here is the Chinese cave composite. And like we discussed, there's no glacial interglacial variability. So the eccentricity peak there is 0. It's dominated by precession. You can see that. 21,000, 23,000 year timescales. And there's some eccentric tilt obliquity component to it. Again, here is the millennial scale. By construction, there's nothing in the lower frequency. Wait for it. This is another one where it's like, I gotta go check my calculations here. When we do the same process and calculate the MMV of East Asian monsoon, purported East Asian monsoon strength, we actually see no peaks in precession. 0 peaks. So it's amazing that something that starts off with such strong precession in the raw record, when we look at the modulation component, it disappears. There's nothing. So there is this peak at obliquity, close to obliquity, which really interested us. What's going on there? We don't know. We'll come to that. But the point here is that the speleothem guys are not actually correct in that paper. There's no imprint of precession in the millennial scale if you do it actually in this step-by-step way to actually isolate those components. There does seem to be some component of obliquity, so we decided to take a closer look at that. So here's obliquity, and the purple is the Chinese delta 18O MMV. And when we took a wavelet, a cross wavelet on these two time series with insulation, you can see that most of this is black. There's not really that much correspondence. And where you do have that correspondence of obliquity comes in a little bit later. You can kind of see it. Obliquity here, 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 maybe. But the key aspect is that the phasing, it's not in phase. And in fact, what this says is that it actually says that Chinese delta 18O leads obliquity, which doesn't make any sense, right? Because obviously something happening in China is not controlling obliquity. But what that does point to is a long lag, okay? It points to a long lag in the climate system, and we'll talk about what that is. But the take-home messages from here is that it's not coherent with precession or obliquity, even though it has a peak of obliquity, it's not coherent across the board. And the fact that the speleothem geochemistry leads Earth's obliquity implies there's a complex control and complex relationship between orbital forcing and these Chinese speleothems. So if we arrange these side by side, you can kind of see the difference. Okay, so this is the millennial scale variability of methane. Here's the millennial scale variability of Chinese delta 18O. And these things are not alike, basically. So I should just stop here and say, there's a question of what about other records for comparison? Well, I'm able to give this talk here today on this paper being published solely because of the hard work of several scientists and geochemists who came up with these records. These are state-of-the-art records. They're probably the best thing we have for Pleistocene climate when it comes to the timing, when it comes to the age control, when it comes to the measurements and the analytical uncertainty as well. Okay, so we can't really do this on very many other records. Hopefully we'll have more and more records coming out, and there are, as we speak, that are approximating these records in terms of timescale as well as resolution, but these are really unique, so I want to point that out. And I also wanted to look at other records that can provide some. So what do I do with all of this, right? I've analyzed a bunch of stuff statistically, and it's a cool result. Yeah, okay, this doesn't have insulation. What does this mean for the methane cycle? What does this mean for carbon cycle? So when in our hunt for other records, we said, okay, you know what? Let's look at oxygen isotopes or deuterium isotopes in the ice core itself. So I'm looking at changes in the isotope composition of the ice core from the same ice core that we're actually getting this methane from, okay, which is kind of interesting. And when we do that, here's the same walkthrough of our algorithm. Here's the deuterium delta 2H record from the ice in Antarctica. And you can see there's a strong eccentricity, there's quite strong obliquity, a little bit of precession. And then when we look at the millennial scale, again, by construction, there's nothing in the lower frequency. And lo and behold, when we look at the warm events, cool events for the envelope, and then construct our magnitude of millennial scale variability for Antarctica, it also doesn't show any precessional peak and shows a very weak obliquity peak. So it's kind of fizzles out. It doesn't really show something as strong. This is amazing. You have an ice core from the same ice core that you measure the isotopes, it shows you this, but if you measure the methane, it shows you something completely different. What's going on here? Well, when we then compared this record with the Chinese delta 18O, here is the comparison of the MMV of Antarctic delta D, completely independent age control, independent dates, totally different archive. The way it records climate is totally different. Here's a speleothem underground in a cave in China. Look at that. there is a remarkably high degree of in-phase coupling across temporal scales between these two records. So this actually says that our calculation of MMV in the Chinese records actually means something. And it's talking, or it's basically going on the same beat in the millennial scale as the Antarctic ice core stable isotope signature as well, which is some combination of climate over Antarctica. So the fact that these two display strong coherence essentially says that it bolsters our results for the methane as well. It basically says that these two are talking about some type of long-term atmospheric, ocean atmospheric coupling or ice sheet coupling, and that's how these signals are basically getting transferred. One thing that is a point of curiosity that I'm actually actively digging in a different way is that we start to see this increase at about 430,000 years ago or so in millennial scale activity. And there's a bunch of reasons why we think this is, but this is interesting. It basically says that the extent, the magnitude of millennial scale variability has been increasing for the past 400,000 years, according to the ice core and the Chinese records. Okay. So this really gave us confidence to take bolder steps to interpret these differences that we're actually observing. So what does this mean? What does this mean when we go back to what we want to talk about in terms of methane, in terms of carbon cycling? How do we relate this all back to this? Okay, so the way I'm doing this is basically what I'm calling the indisputable observations, basically things that fall out of math, out of statistics, things you can't really argue with. So we'll start with these. The MMV, the magnitude of millennial scale variability of methane, it contains a fingerprint of insulation forcing that is in phase, arguing for a direct control, coherent, significant, and persistent throughout the Pleistocene. Okay. The speleothem delta 18 does not contain any influence of a direct control of insulation on the millennial scale. This is just out of math. It just falls out of this. These are observations that can't really dispute. And the Antarctic ice core deuterium and speleothem delta 18, they're strongly aligned on millennial timescales, including in their magnitude. So now part of this conclusion side is the disputable inferences from this. So, this is something that I'm going out on a limb here and saying, but, totally welcome critique on this, because how we make sense of these observations and findings is really going to be key to how we understand methane cycling across the Pleistocene. So I did mention that there is debate about what speleothem delta 18 in East Asia actually means. And I'm not going to go into details here, but there are assertions of atmospheric changes, of winds actually changing, of sources changing. So we don't really know if it actually translates to more rainfall causing more wetlands. There's uncertainty there. But let's assume that there is no uncertainty. And let's assume that East Asian speleothem delta 18 is directly monsoon rainfall amount. If that's the case, the fact that these two are decoupled, that methane is decoupled from East Asian delta 18 is a screaming signature that northern boreal sources actually were really important. Maybe permafrost, maybe not, maybe northern hemisphere wetlands. Our analysis cannot distinguish between the sources there, but this really pushes back on a lot of inferences when it comes to the tropics leading. That's the caveat, though, is that it comes with a caveat of if East Asian speleothem delta 18 is monsoon rainfall. And the other aspect is that if it does not reflect monsoon rainfall, methane could still be forced by high latitudes, but we need other tropical records that are required to refute this claim. And in particular, we need more records like these speleothem records from the southern hemisphere. So I would argue Congo, places like South America, Papua New Guinea, the Amazon, we need these long records to actually be able to refute that methane is being driven by the tropics or by the northern latitudes. And finally, the coupling between ice cores and speleothems, vastly different places. This indicates that large-scale atmospheric oceanic circulation could be controlling and driving the millennial scale aspects in both of these regions. So something like the bipolar seesaw is a term that people use, which has to do with coupling between the hemispheres on millennial scales that's mediated by oceanic circulation. But it involves changes in the cryosphere and so on. But this nuance right here, the fact that these two are so coupled says that there has to be some type of physical climatic connection, or at least that they're responding to the same beats. And the beats that they're responding to really don't have much to do with insolation. It's some type of internal rhythm that's generated by the Earth's climate, not really has any imprint from insolation. So when we take a look at all of these in a combined way, what we're positing is really that, there's some component of, even if there is some component of East Asian speleothem delta, that talks towards rainfall, we kind of hedged our bets here and said, we can't really distinguish between one or the other, but this does put back the northern latitudes back into play, because we need some other records and we need to do these processes, this algorithm, to try and figure out if we can find precession in a tropical record, in tropical rainfall. Because again, East Asian monsoon delta may not necessarily be rainfall and may not be representative of tropical rainfall. So the kind of the clarion call here is a need to develop more tropical records, particularly from the southern hemisphere. But it says that we cannot rule out northern hemisphere sources. And there are different sources, we can talk about this, but essentially this pushes back on analysis that say we have nothing to worry about when it comes to things like permafrost or even northern hemisphere wetlands in terms of methane. And I should caveat that a lot of firm evidence does say we don't need to worry about things like cloth rates, for example, being destabilized. But when it comes to permafrost, things are still debated. And particularly summer temperatures, that if they go really high, you can have these sort of collapses that we can see right here. That is going to give off lots of methane. So I'll stop right here. I've got about 7 minutes for questions. So thank you very much. Yeah, Andy.
Oh, so can you go back to the slide of MMV of the wavelet analysis for
that one?
Which one is that?
For China or for methane?
Or methane.
Ooh, here you go. There.
Yeah. So what do you make out of the fact that some of these I mean, you've got that precession beat in there, but it's really strong, say, for the last 250,000 years. But before that, it's kind of, maybe it comes and goes. And is there something to be learned about?
You mean here versus here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting to think that that coincides with about the time that China and Antarctica start to show an increase in the trend. So it's actually really interesting to think that methane does not show any trend. And guess what? Insolation, we know, doesn't trend over the Pleistocene. So that gives even more robust independent verification that methane is beating to insolation to some extent. But this is a very interesting observation that this kind of fizzles out and comes back over here, or it's really strong over here. Now, what I'm not showing here, Andy, is that the methane record goes back 800,000 years. I cut this off at 640 because that's the length of the field. That's where uranium-thorium disequilibrium dating basically, you start to hit uncertainty there that you can't date beyond that. So I cut this off, but I will say that it actually does come back a little bit stronger at about 800. So I wonder if this actually has to do with eccentricity forcing, the 400,000 year eccentricity actually playing a role somehow, maybe modulating summer temperatures in the high boreal latitudes. That is not that gets suppressed, which basically sort of breaks down this relationship on the millennial scale. Another alternative could be that things start to become more in sync as you drive a stronger bipolar seesaw. So the fact that you're trending in the other two records basically says that the Earth's climate system on the millennial scale is becoming more and more synchronous and larger in magnitude. So I wonder if that can also be a feedback onto this methane and breaks down that relationship before that. So good question, not really sure in terms of the actual answer, but there's some very tantalizing possibilities. Yes?
At the beginning of your talk, you showed the methane increase is accelerating during the recent decade after some deceleration in the previous decade. So what caused this behavior?
Okay, so the question is basically that in the modern observed methane record, that there's basically accelerations and decelerations. And the question from Janjan is what causes these changes here? I'm going to try and see if I can quickly go to that slide right here. So basically your inquiry is about what's causing these changes right here. It's a good question. A lot of people have, there's debate on this, but people have attributed things like agriculture in Southeast Asia and India actually, and changes in the expansion and the processes through which agriculture is conducted as a potential way to decelerate this. But the acceleration seems to be linked with fracking actually, more than anything else. That you can kind of see it takes off post-recession. So, but it's still debated in terms of trying to look at these top-down analyses of, you have this one record of atmospheric methane, and then what are the actual drivers here? So I can't comment too much more on that, but people have attributed, things like technological advances and hydrofracturing.
So there's no possibility that that's an oceanic uptake?
No, one of the ways that you can tell that that's not really the case is by looking at the isotopes of the methane as well. Yeah, as far as I understand, the ocean's not doing this. Yeah, I'm gonna shift to some chat questions on the chat here. Okay, so Diane has a question here. Diane says, can you comment on the surprising result that there's no precession in the raw methane record? This also suggests that monsoon tropical wetlands may not be the dominant driver on orbital timescales. And she said, Andy asked my second question, so please ignore it. So it's a great question. Thank you for the question, Diane. And Diane is basically alluding to how low precession is here in the raw record of methane. This is actually really interesting because all of these inferences of methane being tropical, they come from this peak. So Diane, it's a very good question. And it's something that people have kind of skimmed over to some extent because they have filtered these records to just look at precession. And when you do, the precessional variability in methane actually matches really well with, say, the Asian monsoon or insolation as well. But you're absolutely right that it is basically very minor in comparison in the raw record to glacial interglacial changes, but also obliquity. So it's a good question. And it would suggest that, but people basically say, oh, glacial interglacial changes drive methane, but we're going to just focus on the precessional component. And that's being driven by the monsoon because of that match with the Asian speleothem record. So maybe there is something more to that, given that, we're finding a little more complexities in the control of methane. Okay, there's one more question in the chat here. If speleothem is showing lower latitudes of monsoon, does that mean that modulation latitudes would rise even higher? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that question, but if I think I understand correctly, basically the lower latitudes of the monsoons, which is the speleothem, even though it's at 30 degrees north, the fact that it does not match the same spectral signatures as methane is the inference through which we basically say that methane is not really driven by the tropics. Okay, and then Jess has a comment. Jess says, comment on Diane's question. Tropical records do actually have strong 100K 41K, so it doesn't rule out a tropical methane source per se. Absolutely right. So just because the methane peak in precession is small doesn't necessarily mean that tropics are not the driver of methane, because there is actually a lot of 100 kiloyear and 41 kiloyear variance in tropical records. It's just that it does not exist in these East Asian speleothems. And really a lot of this narrative is focused on the East Asian speleothems, because that's what the last 20 years of paleoclimatology has basically migrated towards, and essentially this coupling has been proposed for the last over the latest Pleistocene based on that. Yeah.
So just one other question. You had a throwaway comment at the end that we don't need to worry about clathrate degradation.
Yeah.
Could you expand
Sure,
on that?
absolutely. So Andy's question is, can I expand on the fact that I said we don't need to worry too much about marine clathrates, which are a significant source of methane, which we know probably played a big role in longer geological history, say the PETM and so on. Really, some of the screaming evidence that clathrates do not come into picture actually comes from geochemical analysis of the methane bubbles themselves in the ice cores, primarily through radiocarbon analysis, so 14CH4.
No, I meant for today.
Yeah. So exactly. So 14CH4 and clumped isotopes of methane. So the clumping of 13C to delta D. These two things can actually tell you how old the methane is, the source, and it can also tell you about where potentially the source is coming from. Okay. Now, when you look at the Pleistocene, and mind you, people have not done this as extensively. This has only been done for certain millennial scale events. There is zero evidence when you have the highest methane release or the lowest methane release in sort of recent Pleistocene history that any of them are coming from a clathrate signature. Okay.
A clathrate signature would be dead in radiocarbon.
Would be dead in radiocarbon. Exactly. They actually find atmospheric values. Okay. So they find a wetland signature. So that has been used actually as a silver bullet. People say that, when you look at MIS5E or MIS5C or some of these warmer periods, we don't see any evidence of sourcing from clathrates. And so that's really why we don't necessarily need to be worried about destabilization, which lines up with some of the geophysical inferences as well.
But I guess I don't understand, because we're so outside the envelope now in total methane.
Yep.
And where global climate is going, that I'm not sure how can you extrapolate from that something that the clathrates that are there now couldn't in the future be destabilized.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's a good point. The rationale for that is really coming from looking at projections of temperature in the future, despite what methane's at, and basically feeding that into well-documented physical models of the instability of these clathrates, for example, and how much you have to warm bottom water by. Okay. So the next 100 years or so, they basically don't add up. And I'm fairly convinced, but I mean, at the end of the day, you are right that the scale of the problem now versus something like 5E or even Bowling-Allarod, that's a very common one that people use. The changes in methane don't really rival what's going on right now. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that methane can be oxidized to carbon dioxide. So I think anything to capture the methane and store, like same like we are capturing the CO2 and storing it.
That's a good point. I'm really not an expert in that field in terms of direct capture of methane. I'm not really sure. I know people use things like zeolites, for example, to try and carbon capture of methane directly at the source itself. But from what I've read, at least, I'm not necessarily too bullish on the fact that those can really significantly draw down methane. So I really think that it has to come from either regulation or just that we need to stop burning as much methane in order to reduce it. So again, I'm not an expert on that. So I don't really know about the carbon capture aspect, but
Cal, do you have any ideas of what you said? Basically, maybe something else besides orbital forcings is driving or controlling that correlation between the East Asian methane, speleothems, and the with an idea of what's happening?
Yeah. So basically, the question is, you know, I alluded towards the fact that there's a lot of coupling between the Antarctic ice cores, delta D, and the Chinese speleothem delta 18O. And given the fact that they don't necessarily resonate on these insolation frequencies, what else might be causing this? Well, think about it from a signal processing perspective. You can get periodicities or quasi-periodicities or non-periodicities just by the way in which some system works. Okay, so if you don't have something that's necessarily regular, that might be that's how the system is built. So one potential example, and what we think we put forth in this paper, has to do with ice. Okay, so ice, you know, you can grow an ice sheet, and the way that the ice sheet gets ablated, or basically maybe gets sloughed off into the ocean, or the way that it basically gets terminated is not going to be the same every time it grows back and grows, you know, every time it grows and then falls and then grows and falls. You're going to have slight different changes. And people have alluded this in terms of the topography of on top of which you have the ice sheet being built, also basically having a memory of that, right? Like as you more and more and more, you kind of glaciate, deglaciate, glaciate, deglaciate. The regolith, basically, the regolith hypothesis, is also something that has some memory that it can imprint onto that system, right? So something like that could easily explain some of these non-periodicities, or the fact that these two are so coupled, but they don't really beat with insolation, might just be something telling us about the fact that the spacing between millennial scale events, when you have, you know, North Atlantic, or when you have ice melting and sloughing off into the North Atlantic, disrupting circulation, that may not be predictable. Basically, that's what that says, is that really is beating to the way in which this ice sheet is growing and collapsing. So something like that can easily give you two things that resonate with each other, but not necessarily something else. That's a modulator. Does that sound okay? I mean, does that answer your question?
So, yeah.
Okay. So essentially, it has to do with the coupling between the geosphere and the cryosphere is what we posit. Yep. And it's insensitive actually to insolation. Okay, let's stop right here. Yep, and thanks everyone for coming and watching. See you all next week.